Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching the first two domain controllers, and in this video we're going to be looking at installing Server 2008 and Active Directory. Now in this video we're going to be looking at actually building the brain of the GlobalMantics network. Without having a domain controller, you don't have a domain, so we got to have that guy. Then before we jump headlong into the whole installation thing, I want you to be able to understand a little bit about hardware requirements. I want you to be able to evaluate that, because if you're getting ready to install Server 2008 on a box that does not support or does not have the required hardware on it, you're going to be sad. Now, I don't want you to be sad. So also, we're going to talk about the whole editions thing. I want you to be a little more familiar with the different editions of Server 2008. Then after we've selected an edition of Server 2008 to install for GlobalMantics, I'm going to talk you through the bare metal installation process. Now, bare metal installation is kind of a fancy way for something that's very, very simple, and I'll share that with you. Then we're going to walk through the initial configuration task list. And this initial configuration task list is just a really easy way to get your server set up with the basic requirements of, a server name, an IP address, all that good stuff. Then we're going to talk about how to take your server and actually install Active Directory domain services on it. And it's not that hard, so don't be intimidated by that at all. Then we're going to turn right around after we have a domain controller set up, and we're going to set up a second domain controller, and we'll talk about why that is in just a little bit here. Then we also need to make sure that our two domain controllers can talk, and so we're going to walk you through how we can test out this big thing called replication. And again, we have all these big fancy words, and then at the end of the day, they all have very simple definitions. All right, so let's go ahead and let's get started with this. We're really beginning to build the brain of GlobalMantics, and so what your mission is going to be is you're going to be building two domain controllers to start off with. And we're going to be building these at the New York headquarters. So let's take a look here at the hardware, what we're going to be building. We're going to start off with our first domain controller, and we're going to name it NYDC1-2K8. The IP address is going to be as such, 192.168.5.2. The reason why this is 2 instead of 1 is that our router is 192.168.5.1. So that's the reason for that. We're going to have a 3 gigahertz 64-bit CPU, central processing unit. We're going to start off with 4 gigabytes of RAM. That's a pretty fair amount there. We're going to have two 120 gigabyte hard drives. So plenty of storage space to start off with. And we're also going to have a gigabit network interface card. Now, this particular domain controller, this guy right here, this first one we're going to be building, is going to be creating the globalmantics.com domain. So obviously, this first one is going to be very important. We don't want to mess this one up because everything else will be squirreled up after that. Now, we're also going to have a second domain controller. The second domain controller, we're going to name it similar. It's going to be NYDC2-2K8. The IP address is going to be almost identical, with the exception that it's going to be .3 instead of .2. Similar hardware, nothing really extra special here. What we're really doing is really building a replica of the first domain controller. And this domain controller is going to be joining the domain. All right, so we're going to be creating the domain here, and we're going to be taking this guy and joining him to the globalmantics.com domain. Now, these two guys are connected together with a network switch. All right, it's a very simple connection. We just take a couple of Cat5 cables, hook them into a network switch, and this network switch is then turned around and hooked into our T1 connection. And this T1 connection is, of course, going to be connected via a router. Our router is also going to be providing for us DHCP services, too. Now, we're setting up two almost identical domain controllers, really for what we call fault tolerance. So here's the simple idea behind fault tolerance. Let's say DC1 goes down. All right, let's just say it dies and becomes a quivering mass of metal. Well, not a big deal because you still have this guy up and running, and vice versa. So fault tolerance is always a good idea, having a little bit of that redundancy in your network to make sure that if one machine dies, you can still continue to do business. Now, there's also a performance thing happening here too, because if we only have one domain controller running the show, and it's just getting the snot beat out of it all the time, well, that's not so good. But if you have two machines running the show, at least two, and a lot of times you may have more than two domain controllers out there on your network, well, obviously two machines are better than one, right? So if this guy starts to get, a little bit too beat up, this guy can also handle a lot of the load too. Now, let's say that we have 2 domain controllers on 2 different floors of your building. Well, that's pretty neat, because then we can have our users log in using this domain controller, or we could also have users log in with this domain controller. So again, 2 heads are better than 1, 2 DCs are better than 1 as well. All right, so this is what we're building. This is what your hardware looks like. So let's talk about what we're going to end up with. Once we've set up these 2 domain controllers, we're going to have this. We're going to have that top part of our globalmatics.com domain. Now remember that this is a forced root domain because it's the very first domain that we're creating inside of our premises. So again, don't be confused by these big fancy words. Forced root domain just means it's the very first domain in our whole dog and pony show here. So we're going to have 2 domain controllers, NYDC1. We're going to have NYDC2. They're going to be both part of globalmatics.com. And remember what we talked about with the whole sites thing in the last video? We're going to be naming our site New York Site. Okay? I like to keep things simple. These 2 guys are over in New York, so let's give it the New York name. Now, let's go back and jump back to the big picture real quick. We are building this part, all right, of our whole big globalmatics.com scenario. So at the end of the day, we're going to have this part. Now, in the last video, we were looking at this domain, and this is kind of a smaller section of the domain, but I know you were thinking this, so let's just go ahead and get this out of the way here real quick. Yep, that's right. Legend of Zelda fans, you remember this? Yes, it does look like a Triforce. And was that accidental? Yeah, more or less. But let's just go ahead and get this out of the way right now. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about the hardware requirements now of this particular edition of server of Microsoft Windows Server. Now you notice here that I have a link up here at the top that will direct you to more information about this, but I'm going to give you the quick highlights. I want you to be able to evaluate whether or not a particular machine can handle even just the basic installation of server. To start off with, we have to have a minimum of 1 gigahertz on the processor. Now, if you're going to be using the 64-bit edition, which, by the way, 64-bit editions are just faster, can handle more memory, you need at least 1.4 gigahertz for the 64-bit edition. Obviously, anything faster is going to be better, and if you're going to be using the Itanium-based edition for Server 2008, you need an Intel Itanium 2 processor. I'll talk with you in just a few seconds here more about the Itanium edition. For RAM, you need at least half a gig to install, period. If you have 256 gigabytes of RAM in your machine, it's not going to work. All right, so you got to make sure that this is there in the hardware. Now, obviously, we need more. This recommended you have at least 2 gigabytes of RAM for this thing to run smoothly. Now, I'm recommending that you get as much as you can. Because, seriously, can you ever have too much RAM in a machine? I think not. All right, let's talk about available hard disk space. A minimum to install, you need at least 10 gigabytes. It's recommended you have 40 gigabytes or greater. And you might be kind of laughing about this because you're thinking, well, okay, a server with only 40 gigabytes of hard drive space. If you're trying to install Server 2008 over the top of Server 2003 in an existing network, this might be an issue. All right, so it's something that you want to think about. If you're installing a brand new set of machines like what we're doing here together, it's not so much of a big deal because we're starting off with brand new machines. One quick note though, computers that have more than 16 gigabytes of RAM, all right, they're going to need more disk space than machines that are running less. All right, so just kind of keep that in mind in the back of your head as you are evaluating hardware, maybe ordering up some boxes for this. Other BFO stuff, and just so you know, BFO stands for blinding flash of the obvious. All right, DVD drive. Big surprise, right? You need at least 800 by 600 monitor. I don't know if you can even buy a 640 by 480 monitor anymore. Maybe for cash registers, I think, but even cash registers now are pretty high res. You need at least a keyboard, a mouse. And of course, don't forget a network interface card, because what's a server without a network interface card? Well, it's a big fancy box. All right, so moving on here, Now that we know a little bit more about what the hardware requirements are, you can kind of evaluate, what edition should we use for the first two domain controllers. Now, again, I'm pulling this stuff straight off of Microsoft's website. Here's the link. And this one I'm going to really advise you to go to, when you're doing your initial planning, deciding which one to buy, because there's a lot more information on their website, and it's easy to get to. So just jump over there, take a few minutes, and read through that. I'm going to give you the highlights again. We start off with our standard edition, and it does almost everything. There's a few features that are missing. Standard is pretty good for a small to medium environment. It only costs you around $1,000. It comes with 5 client access licenses. So if you're a really small shop and you only have 5 machines, well, hey, this might be the best go for you. Now, you can always buy more client access licenses. Now, a client access license, just so you know, is a license that allows you to access server. It's a very simple concept. Now, when you start getting into client access licenses and what's going to be the best go for your corporation, you really need to consult a Microsoft licensing associate. They know a lot more about this, and a lot of times they'll cut you special deals depending upon how big your network is. So kind of keep that in the back of your head too. The maximum RAM, this is a big deal. All right, you're going to see that the maximum RAM, as we go down the list here, gets bigger and alternates between the different versions. But for 32 bits, right, for a regular 32-bit version, you have a maximum of 4 gigabytes of RAM. And now some of you are thinking, wow, that's not very much. And yeah, it's a little low, but it's a standard edition. The price point is as such. Wait till we start talking about enterprise. If you have the 64-bit edition, 64-bit operating systems can handle more memory, right? You're going to see that with this entire column here. A 64-bit edition of standard can handle 32 gigabytes of RAM. Now, when should you use standard edition? When you are in a small to medium environment, all right? If you're in a small to medium environment, you got, let's say, 5, 10, 15, 20 people. For a small shop, medium environments, you might start to push it a little bit. But, we're really looking at stuff like, file and print servers, less intensive applications. If you don't have that many people in here, standard is a good deal. Enterprise, on the other hand, let's start talking about this one. Enterprise does it all. All the features that are available in Server 2008 are available in Enterprise. Now, the price point obviously is going to reflect that. If you pony up $4,000, you can get 25 client access licenses, and that's just what it comes with off the shelf, by the way. Obviously, you can buy more. For the RAM that it can handle, Enterprise can handle up to 64 gigabytes of RAM, and for the 64-bit edition, 2 terabytes of RAM. Obviously, we're looking at Enterprise for more larger environments. If we need to cluster servers together for high-intensity applications, this is where we're going to go, all right? Data center. Data center is what we're going to see in really big environments, mass environments. That's why I say it's good for all that in a bag of chips. Now, the pricing on this, don't be fooled by it. It's about $3,000 per processor. Not per machine, per processor, all right? So that means if you have, on your motherboard, if you have 4 processors, and that's not uncommon for a server class machine, that thing's going to cost you $12,000. There's a lot of cash involved in data center. Most of the time, data center is going to come pre-installed on that level of machine, just so you know. The same maximum RAM, though, as with Enterprise. We have 64 gigabytes for the 32-bit and 2 terabytes for your 64-bit. Now, the nice thing about data center, other than it being for massive environments, it includes unlimited virtualization licenses. Now, that's going to be a big key for a lot of people. They're going to be very excited about this. Now, if you're not familiar with virtualization, just think about having multiple machines running on one physical box, if you can kind of wrap your head around that. But virtualization is a big, big deal right now. It's going to continue to be a big deal in IT. It's one of those topics you're going to want to get to know. Let's talk about web server now. Web server is, well, it's just that. It's just a web server. The only feature, or I really should say the only role that it has, is IIS, Internet Information Services 7.0. Now, the price point is going to reflect it as well. It's only $469. But all it does is just be a web server. You cannot install Active Directory on it. You can't do a lot of the other stuff that you can with these top three. So for the core of your network, for the brain of your network, you're going to be using these three more so than anything else. Now the maximum RAM, 4 gigabytes and 32 gigabytes, they're pretty much the same thing as standard. And again, when to use this, you need to use this when you need a web server. You really don't need me to explain that, right? Let's talk about this Itanium thing, though. All right, Itanium editions for these high-end web application servers. Now the price is a little bit costly. It is about $3,000. It only handles so many types of roles, though. It's kind of an interesting hybrid. It's expensive, and it can handle just a huge amount of memory. 2 terabytes of RAM. You'll notice here that there is no 32-bit edition of this one, though. The reason for that is that it only works with Itanium 64-bit processors. So you're going to have to watch this. Now, you're going to use this guy when you need to run superpowered databases or high-end applications. The only thing that it has is the application server role and a few other features that allow it to work within the Microsoft server kind of family. All right, so there's the additions of Server 2008. Now we need to stop and think, which edition are we going to use for our first 2 domain controllers? The one that we're selecting is Enterprise Edition 64-bit. Now let me tell you why we're picking that one. We're going to pick this one because it can handle up to 2 terabytes of memory. All right, so and when we're talking about planning a network, we also have to think about the future. We can't just think about, well, what do we need right now? I mean, that's important, but you have to think, okay, are we going to get large very quickly? Can we grow slowly? We're really thinking with this one is that if we can get up to 2 terabytes of memory, we have enough stuff with which to grow. It also has a very complete set of features. So we may not use all of them right off the get-go, but eventually we might, and so we should just have those available. Now, here's one of the biggest reasons why we are picking. We have the cash. Because you saw the prices, right? I mean, they're not cheap. But if you've got the cash, just go ahead and pony up for Enterprise Edition. It's going to be worth it. Now, remember that each of our machines has 4 gigs of RAM, has 2 120 gigabyte hard drives, 3 gigahertz 64-bit quad-core Intel processor, and gigabit network cards. Our machines, our hardware, they're not going to have a problem handling Enterprise Edition. And I put it down here at the bottom. You see here, I say at least at first. As we start adding more and more of a load, as these servers start doing more and more work, as we add users and users request stuff off the servers, well, then we're going to need to be able to expand the hardware probably. So it's something to keep in mind. So we have talked about the different editions. We've talked about the hardware requirements. We have selected an edition for our installation. So let's go ahead and start talking about this bare metal installation process. What do we mean by bare metal? Right? That's kind of a funny term. Let me tell you about the 2 types of Server 2008 installations. They're very simple, so don't let the wordings throw you. When you're doing a bare metal installation like what we're going to do, there is no existing operating system on the hard drive. It's a clean, blank hard drive. If we're going to be doing an upgrade installation, we're going to be installing over the top of Server 2003. That Server 2003 is already there on the hard drive, and we're upgrading it. All right. So now, real quickly, I want to make a couple of quick notes here. You cannot upgrade a Server 2000 machine to Server 2008. Right? You can't do it. If you're going to upgrade Server 2000 to 2008, you have to upgrade to 2003 first. And that's only, again, if it meets the hardware requirements. So if you have a Server 2000 machine, you want to go up to Server 2008, upgrade to 2003, then upgrade to 2008. Kind of a squirrely thing. Bare metal, it's the simplest possible installation scenario. It's the one that's recommended by Microsoft. If it's at all possible, use this one. And it's very easy. You just pop in the DVD and you boot up. Now, for GlobalMantics, we're going to be doing 2 bare metal installations, pretty much back to back. So we're going to be, remember, installing 64-bit Enterprise Edition. And we're just going to start off by installing 2008 on this very first machine. So right now, our hardware is set up. it's plugged into the power and the network switch. Now, one more quick note before we jump on over here, okay? Let's say you selected Standard Edition, right? Let's say you didn't have a lot of cash to start off with. If you didn't have a lot of cash to start off with, you can always upgrade to a higher edition, but you cannot downgrade, all right? You cannot take Data Center Edition and downgrade it to web server, all right? You can't do it. But I do want you to remember that you can always upgrade. So even if you're at this point, you have selected Standard Edition, you got it installed, and all of a sudden your company has just grown to gargantuan proportions really fast, and you're still back with Standard Edition, don't sweat it, okay? You can always upgrade to Enterprise or even to Data Center Edition as long as your hardware will support it. Okay, you know what? Enough talk. Let's move on over to our first server and let's start this installation process. Alright, so here we are over on NYDC1, and you see I have put in the DVD physically into the machine, and you see it is loading the files from the DVD. So this is what you will see on an installation. Nothing really spectacular here, just wanted to show you the boot up screen. And now it's going to move us on over into more or less a wizard interface. If you've ever installed Windows Vista, installing server is not that different. Alright, so let's go ahead and start off here with the very first screen. First of all, we can install different languages if it's available. You see on mine it is not currently. We can install additional language packs later. I can also switch to different time formats. We're going to stick here to United States since it is going to be in New York. And also the ability to switch over to different keyboard or input methods. Again, we're sticking with US, and we'll tell it next. Now, we have a few options here on the install now. I could go ahead and hit this button, but just wanted to show you and point out a couple of other things. What to know before installing Windows. You remember all that stuff I was telling you about just a little bit ago in terms of the hardware requirements and all that stuff? Well, here it is again. So if you want to see it again, you could read through it and you'll know all the stuff that I just told you. All right. So moving on along, I'm going to go ahead and close that one. Alright, so and there's also a repair your computer option, and this is what we're going to use in case of a disaster. In case our machine just goes haywire one day, we actually have the ability to actually pretty easily repair and recover the operating system, although we're going to cover that in a different video in this series. So let's go ahead and let's just hit this big blue install now button and move on to the next stage in the game here. And now you see we get to select the edition of Windows. Now at this point in time, depending upon the disk that you actually have, it may prompt you for a license key. Now if you don't enter in a license key, Server 2008 will automatically default over to a 30-day evaluation version, which is pretty nice of them, I would say, so you can have a chance to learn all the different features. Now this particular edition that I have, you see that I wasn't prompted for the license key. I can always put it in later though. So you see here that I have the full installation options, standard, enterprise, data center, as well as the 3 server core installations. Again, we're going to talk about server core in another video a little bit later on in this series. But let's go ahead and install our enterprise edition here, and we'll tell it next. And of course, we're going to sit back and enjoy this beautifully written license agreements. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. All right, let's go ahead and accept it, and we'll tell it next. Now, here's our 2 installation options. Remember, we were talking about the whole upgrade versus bare metal installation. Well, you see that upgrade is grayed out because, well, there's nothing on this disk, so there's nothing to upgrade. So we're going to go ahead and come down here and click on Custom to install that clean copy, that bare metal that you and I were talking about just a little bit ago. So let's go ahead and click on it. And now we get to decide which hard disk we're going to install server on. Now, remember I was telling you that these machines have 2 120 gigabyte hard drives. So we're going to be installing it here on disk 0. However, we can also do some a little bit of formatting, a little bit of partitioning here. So let's go ahead and click here on Drive Options under the Advanced section. Notice here that these guys are grayed out, delete, and extended format. Let's come over here to new. We're going to create a brand new partition. Now this new partition, we're going to take 80 gigs of this hard drive for the operating system. Now Microsoft recommends that you take at least one partition for your hard drive. So it's going to be 81,920. And we're going to click here on apply. And that's going to slice up this disk 0 into two separate sections. One section is going to be just for the operating system. Now this 40 gigabyte hard drive, this additional partition I created on that same disk, we're going to use it for data. Now there's all kinds of things we can use it for, but Microsoft recommends that your core server live on one given partition. So that's what we're going to do here. So we have the operating system and we have a data partition as well. All right, now what happens if in fact you come to this screen and there's no hard drive showing up and all of a sudden you're kind of freaking out? Now this might happen more so on older machines, but if you have some kind of weird SCSI driver and such, we can use this load driver option and click here on the load driver. You might need to actually load drivers for a particular hard drive controller in your machine if it's an older box. And maybe even if it's a newer box and it's kind of an off-brand. So keep this in mind in case you come to that point where you're like, hey, I'm not seeing any hard drives. And notice that you can install them from a floppy disk, CD, DVD, or even a USB stick. All you got to do is click on the Browse button and then go find that particular media that the driver stored on, and you can go ahead and install that. Now, I don't need to do this right now because obviously I'm going to click on this back button right here because, well, my hard drive show up just fine. So that's not something that you and I are going to need to really worry about at this point. So let's just go ahead and tell it next because, oh, you know what, before we do that, let's make sure we install it to the first 80 gigabyte partition, right? You notice here that I had 40 gigs selected. I almost installed my operating system to the wrong hard drive. Let's not play that game. Remember, this is our very first domain controller. We really don't want to play a lot of games with this one. We want to do this one right. Now you see that I also have the ability to go ahead and format this disk. I'm not going to do that right now because it takes extra time. And we just want to get this guy up and running, so we're going to go ahead and tell it next. And now the wizard takes over. You know, you and I can go play a game of cards, drink a cup of coffee, what have you, and it will pretty much take over from here. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to pause the video while this thing installs, and then as soon as it restarts and we're ready to do the next step, I'll start recording again. Alright, so you see that our server has started now. Hopefully you had a good chance to take a short break there, and I know I did. So let's go ahead and let's follow the little instructions here on the screen. The user's password must be changed before logging on the first time. Now let's go ahead and tell this guy OK, and let's see what it means. You see that this is the administrator password that we're about to create. Now before we create this password, we're going to create what we call a password reset disk. Now this password reset disk is very, very handy to have just on hand in the case something really weird happens. Let's say your network administrator just walks off one day and decides that he or she just isn't coming back. Well, you got to be able to get back into your servers, right? So we can use this tool to create that password reset disk. I'm going to tell it next. Now, we can use floppy disks if we so desire, but we can also use USB keys, which are a whole lot more common nowadays than floppy disks. So while we were rebooting the machine, just so you know, I kind of sneaked in something here. I actually inserted a USB key into the machine. So I'm going to go ahead and use this E drive here, and I'm going to tell it next. And I haven't created a password yet, so I'm going to leave that guy blank. Now, by the way, you can create a password reset disk anytime you like. However, it's always a good idea to do it right up front just so you have it on hand while you're thinking about it, all right? So I'm going to leave it blank because there is no administrator password yet. Tell it next. Oh, looks like this one already has password reset information. I'm going to go ahead and replace it, and that's it. So it took and went ahead and created that reset disk, and I'm going to tell it next. And now it tells you to label the USB key password reset. Make sure you keep it in a safe place, probably along with like your documentation. If you're going to be wise, you really should be documenting lots and lots of stuff when you're doing a network installation. So keep this disk with that secret logbook, probably locked up in a safe somewhere. Alright, I'm going to tell it finish. And now we are ready to actually create the administrator password. So I'm going to go ahead and do that here real quick. Is putting in my standard password for local administrators and then clicking on the little blue arrow or pressing the enter key, 6 of one, half a dozen of another. The password has been changed. I'm just going to hit the enter key and move it on to actually booting up into the desktop, and we can start messing around with the next steps from there. Now while this guy is booting up, I'm going to switch back on over to the slides though, because I want to talk with you about what you're about to see. Alright, so what you're about to see on the screen is called the initial configuration task list. Now basically it's just there for sheer hedonistic convenience. It takes all the stuff that we would normally do in about 8 or 12 different places and puts it into one screen. I really like this. It's really convenient. And it takes all the stuff that we would have to do in a Server 2003 machine, or any other server for that matter, and just gives us an easy way to get it done. So here's what you and I are going to have to do. We're going to need to set up the time zone, make sure it's correct. We're going to need to configure our network settings, and here is our network address one more time for you. We're going to be using 192.168.5.2. We also need to set up an initial DNS server, even though that's going to change, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. We're going to also rename the computer to NYDC1-2K8. We're going to have to reboot that. Whenever we first initially install server, it creates this weird randomly generated name that I'm not a big fan of. So we're going to name it something that makes sense to us. We're going to also need to configure automatic updates and feedback. That's one of those things that a lot of times people just kind of gloss over. We're going to talk about that guy though. We can also configure the remote desktop. And since we're going to be using remote desktop in future videos, we're going to go ahead and set that one up now. Now it is optional. You don't have to set it up if you don't like. But we're going to go ahead and go through that process. The last thing I like to do with the ICT is I like to turn it off. Because after you use it once, you don't need it again. You can do everything in the ICT in other places. It's just there for your convenience when you initially set up the server. So whenever you do turn it off and it doesn't come back, you're like, oh no, can I ever get it back? Yeah, you can. There's all kinds of ways to get around to these different functionalities and these different configuration options that we're going to need later on. A lot of them, just so you know, show up in the Server Manager that we're going to be taking a look at soon as well. So here's our task list, here's our punch list, and just so you know, all the stuff is right here on the screen for us. So let's go ahead and move back on over to that server, and let's go ahead and run through this list real quick. Alright, so back here on the server, let's go ahead and start at the top of the list. We're going to go ahead and start with the time zone. I'm going to go ahead and click on this guy and bring this up. Here we go. Now I can go ahead and change the time and date right now. This is accurate, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it as it is. I'm going to go ahead and change the time zone though from Pacific to Eastern because, well, Eastern is where New York is. So always select the time zone that you are in, or I really should say the time zone that the server is in. Alright? I'm going to go ahead and leave it and allow it to automatically adjust the clock for the daylight savings time and tell it OK. Now let's take a look at these other tabs up here. Let's take a look at additional clocks. You can actually show more than one clock if you like. So you could actually show Eastern time and Greenland, or whatever time, Cairo, whatever time, other time zone that your network operates in. Now I'm not going to need to do this because right now our only network lives in New York, and that's it. We don't have any other networks to worry about. But we can show up to 2 additional clocks if you think that's going to be useful to you. If it's just going to confuse you, then don't do that. Let's take a look at this Internet Time tab next. The Internet Time setting allows you to keep synchronization with all the rest of the world. Let's go ahead and click on the Change Settings. Now, it's very important that your machine and all the machines in your network maintain the same time. If the times on your machine start to get a little squirrely, bad things happen on your network. All right? So we want to make sure that we're staying up with the rest of the world. Now, Microsoft has a time server, if you like, but we can also use one of the government time servers as well. So that's up to you. If you want to trust Microsoft's time server, fantastic. They do a good job. You can also use additional time servers as well. I'm going to go ahead and leave mine set to the Microsoft settings for the time being. If I ever find an issue where my time and Microsoft's time aren't syncing up and that's causing me trouble with other machines, not necessarily on my network but also other networks that I might be communicating with, then I might come back and change it. Right now it's pretty good though. Keep in mind that all the rest of your client machines in your network, in your domain, are going to be pulling their time from this server or from your other domain controllers. So it's very important that this server maintain the correct time. If a machine is on your network with the wrong time, then that can be a security violation, right? And when there are security violations, Server 2008 gets really angry with machines that don't keep the right time. This is an important setting to take a look at and just kind of know about. If you don't do anything with it, if you don't change in the settings, you leave it set to time.windows.com, it's probably going to be okay. If you want to know more about it, you can come down here and click on what is Internet Time Synchronization, and you can bring up a little help box here, and it's going to ask me, do I want to get the latest online content when I search help? Well, as long as my machine is connected to the internet, this will work. Let's go ahead and tell us yes. I'm not sure if this machine is going to actually talk to anything on the outside world because we haven't configured anything on the IP side. Our router, remember, is DHCP enabled, right? So DHCP can hand out an address. Let's see if we actually got one here. Yeah, it looks like we did. If we didn't have internet access, there would be a little yellow bar up top that would say, hey, you're not connected to the internet. Looks like we are. That's good news for us. And we can learn more about internet clock and the time settings. But I've told you pretty much what you need to know about it. It's an important setting, but if you leave it alone, nothing bad will happen because you'll simply synchronize with Microsoft servers. All right, I'm going to go ahead and tell this guy, okay, this is set all right. Let's go ahead now, let's configure our networking. Now, right now, we know we have a DHCP address because we were able to actually go out to the internet, contact Microsoft servers for the latest help documents. Now, I double-clicked here on the local area connection to bring up the status box. Looks like I do have some sent and received bytes here. That's good. I'm going to go into the properties of this network card. Now, quick notes. Notice here that Server 2008 does support IP version 6. Well, that's really neat if you're on an IP version 6 network. We still live in an IP version 4 world. So, unless, of course, you are in a country that does support IP version 6, you can go and just uncheck this. Okay? It's not going to hurt anything, and it's not going to help anything either. So go ahead and check it unless you are in an IP version 6 network. We're going to be looking and paying attention to IP version 4 because here in the States, that's what we're going to be on probably for the next 5 years or so, at least at the time of this recording. So we're going to go ahead and go into the properties for IP version 4. This should look familiar to you. This is not anything new. This is the IP configuration option. We're going to be not just obtaining an IP address automatically. All of your servers really should have static IP addresses, and that's what we're going to set up right now. Let's go ahead and select use the following IP address, and I'm going to hit the numlock key on my keyboard here and type 192.168.5, and remember that was going to be 0.2, right? Our subnet mask is configured for us. Good enough. And our default gateway is going to be our router. So it's going to be 192.168.5.1. And that is the address of your router most of the time. It might also be a proxy server, depends on your network, but for GlobalManTix, it's going to be our router. Let's take a look at this DNS server thing. Okay, remember that from the last video how our DNS servers are really like a phone book, right? Well, our router also happens to provide us with some DNS services. So for the right now, I'm going to have my DNS server be the routers. Now, I can always change this, and you know what? After we do this whole DC promo and promoting it to a domain controller thing, we're going to find that this is going to change, but I'm going to bring you back to that. So kind of put a little pencil mark in that in your head. And we'll come back to this, and I'll show you how it's going to change after we do this whole DC promo thing. I'm going to tell it OK, and I'm going to tell it close, and now I'm going to close this network connections window as well to bring me back to the ICT. All right, so we have our time zone, we have the networking configured. Let's take a look at the computer name now and the domain. Here is the current computer name, Win-903. That's that. I think it's an O. W139GDX. That's really nasty. So let's go ahead and let's change the computer name right now. In order to rename this machine, I'm going to come down here and click on the change button. And here's the computer name as it stands. We're going to get rid of that thing here, and we're going to switch it over to NYDC1-2K8. There we go. Now, right now, I'm not going to be joining it to a domain. The reason for that is that we don't have a domain to join it to. You can't join it to something that doesn't exist. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK right now. Now it's going to tell me that I need to restart the computer, and it's not kidding. It's really not going to let me do a lot until I restart this baby. So let's go ahead and let's do that here real quick. Tell it OK, and we're going to tell it to close. And now, once again, it says, hey, you must restart your computer to apply these changes. Let's go ahead and let's restart it now. Let's just get it over with. And so while this guy is rebooting, once again, I'm going to pause the video, and as soon as it boots back up, I'll be right back and we'll log in. Alright, so DC1 has rebooted as you see here. So let's go ahead and let's do a Control-Alt-Delete to log in. And we're logging in with the local administrator password. Want to make sure that I mention that. This is the local administrator password. I'm pressing the Enter key here, going ahead to log in. And the ICT should pop up here really quick, because unless we tell it not to, the ICT just keeps coming back after every reboot. You know, it's really handy the first time you use it, but it's not that handy after that. All right, so let's go ahead and finish these guys up, and let's go ahead and turn it off. Right now, I'm going to move on over here to enable automatic updating and feedback. Let's take a look at this. This might be something that your company's security policy dictates to you. We can go ahead and just enable Windows automatic updating. That's not necessarily the best policy, though. Let me tell you why. If you're planning on running third-party software on your servers or inside of your network as a whole, sometimes the automatic updates will interfere with that third-party software. Microsoft does a pretty good job at keeping up with a lot of the stuff that's out there, but it can't do everything. There's just too much stuff. So we're going to go in and manually configure the settings. Let's start off up top here. The automatic updating. Let's go ahead and take a look here in the change settings, because right now it's not configured. We can install updates automatically. We can pick the time of the day that they're always installed. We can download the updates, but let me choose whether to install them. We can check for updates, but let me choose whether to download and to install them. This is my recommendation to you. Now, let me tell you why. If you download the updates, but you don't want to use them, then they sit there taking up your hard drive space. Right? I'm not a big fan of that. If you install updates automatically, you might get stuff you don't want. So go ahead and have it check for updates, but allow you to choose whether to download and install them altogether. Now, you can also select never check for updates, but that's maybe not the best idea either, because if you're not subscribed to like a Microsoft email list of some type, and there is a lot of them out there, by the way, you may not know when the updates come out. So go ahead and I say leave it here, because you're not going to do any damage. You're not going to be taking up any hard drive space. It just lets you know when there's updates to download. All right. So we're also going to go ahead and include recommended updates when downloading or notification. You know, sometimes Microsoft has some stuff that they recommend to download. It's not critical to your server system, but it might be a really good idea. It might be one of those nice little helpful things. So we'll go ahead and we'll leave that guy check marked as well. We'll tell it OK. And now let's take a look at the Windows error reporting. Right now you see that the current setting is it's going to want to ask you every time an error occurs whether or not you want the server to call home to Microsoft and see if there's a solution available. Well, let's take a look at the different settings here. Now we can automatically send detailed reports. That may or may not be the best idea, though, especially if there is sensitive information on that a particular application is handling at the time. Yeah, may not be the best thing to send to Microsoft. You can also send summary reports, which are a little more secure because it just provides summary information. This is obviously going to be the safest so that you can decide as the administrator whether or not server is going to get to call home. You can also just not participate. And when errors happen, you can just go onto Microsoft.com and look them up yourself. It's up to you. I'm going to go ahead and have it ask me about sending reports every time an error occurs. You know, in GlobalMantics, we're a securities firm. We sell stocks. We deal with more or less bank accounts. And so we don't want sensitive information. We don't even want that risk that that information might get sent over and through the internet cloud. So let's go ahead and let's have it ask us and tell it okay. Now let's take a look at this customer experience improvement program. Right now we are not participating. We're going to leave it at that, but we're going to take a look at the settings. You can either participate, and basically what happens is that server collects information and sends it back home as to how you are using it. And they take that data and use it to improve server products. I mean, it's not really rocket science or anything, but since, again, we're a securities firm, we're not going to be participating because we want our server to be as secure as it possibly can. So we're going to go ahead and not participate in that. All right, so that guy is all set up. Let's go ahead and click on close for him. And now we need to go ahead and check and see if there's any updates that are important, specifically security updates. All right, so we'll go ahead and click here on this install updates button because we're starting off our network brand new and clean. So I'm going to go ahead and start to download these updates. Looks like I have about 25 megs to download and install. So I'm going to pause the video while this thing is going. There's not a lot to see. It's just going to download them, and then as soon as we can take the next step, I'll begin recording again. Alright, I decided to go ahead and start recording again here, even though this isn't finished. You'll notice here that it's installing update 4 of 6. You'll see the update that is installing. And at any time, if I decide, hey, you know what, I don't think I like the look of that, I can go ahead and stop that installation cold in its tracks. Now, whether or not that's a good idea, because most of the time we're going to be downloading security updates, and hopefully those fix more things than it breaks. In general, security updates are good. However, at times we do have to sacrifice some security for usability. It's just a fact of life in IT. Hopefully in the future there's workarounds for any security holes that usability provides. But Microsoft is pretty good nowadays about trying to keep their products more secure and more safe for us as administrators and for home users. And I see here that this guy is just about done. And sometimes the updates will require a reboot. Sometimes they will not. It will depend upon the types of updates that are actually being downloaded and installed. Now, since this is our very first installation, you notice that I didn't review the updates. I just went ahead and hit the download install button and said, you know what, server, just do your thing. Just get me the latest and greatest stuff. And right now we're just trusting Microsoft that everything's going to work okay. All right, so you see that the updates were successfully downloaded and installed now. So we need to go ahead and restart now. Looks like this one is a restart kind of update. So I'm going to restart the machine, and then as soon as I have logged back onto the machine and brought it back up, I'll restart the recording. Alright, so our server has rebooted here. You see that I'm logging back in, and it's telling us that it installed new updates. That's fantastic. I can go ahead and click here and check to see which updates were actually installed. And this is one of those things that you really should stop and look at. Because if there's one of these updates that is causing problems, then we can also go here to installed updates. Let's take a look here at this really quick. We can actually remove any of these items as well. Kind of a nice little feature in case something is kind of squirreling up your server. Not a problem. We can always undo it. Just select it and then hit uninstall, and away it'll go. Alright, so let's go ahead and let's close this window. Let's get back over here to the ICTs now. I'm going to scroll down a little bit so you can see down here underneath number 3. We've done everything else in our punch list except for add roles and add features. We're going to wait and do this stuff over in the Server Manager. but we do want to go ahead and enable remote desktops. Let's go ahead and turn this guy on here real quick so we can use it later on. I'm going to go ahead and allow connections only from computers running remote desktop with network level authentication. In this little pop-up box here, you see that it is actually going to turn on the remote desktop firewall exception. Now, firewall normally will just block any remote desktop requests or communication. Well, we don't want that. We want to be able to administrate this machine from a Vista client. So we're going to want to make sure that's turned on. And rather than having to go into the firewall, well, server is going to do that for us. So that's really nice. I'm going to go ahead and tell that guy OK. Now, I could go ahead and allow connections from computers running any version of remote desktop. That's not so secure. We want to make sure that only computers that are logged into our network, globalmantics.com, which I know doesn't exist yet, I know, we're getting to that, but we'll only allow users and computers that are logged into our network to have access to remote desktop. Now, let's click here on the select users. Now, I could add users if any existed, but right now we really don't have anything other than what's built in, and quite honestly right now only the administrator has access to use remote desktop, and that's not such a bad thing. Now, we're going to talk more about remote desktop later on once we have users and such, but for right now all we need to know is that us as administrators, we have access to this and pretty much nobody else. So we're going to tell that guy OK, click OK again, and our ICT tasks are finished. So let's go ahead and let's put a check mark here and do not show this window at logon. Again, it's fantastic for the initial configuration, not so good after that. So we're going to go ahead and close this window, and that will bring up Server Manager. Again, in case you need to get to any of those features again, almost all that stuff is over underneath Start Menu and the Control Panel. Alright, so now our Server Manager is coming up. The Server Manager is a fantastic tool to do what you would do on a day-to-day basis with your server. You're going to get to know this interface really well, and it's very handy. Microsoft keeps with each iteration of Windows Server, trying to make it easier to use for us as administrators. So a lot of the stuff we're going to be seeing is over here in the tree view, and then we have the detail view over here. Now, before we move on to the next step, let's move back on over to the slides. I want to talk with you a little bit about what we're about to do next. So our server operating system is installed. We've done the initial configuration. We've got all that set up. We're now ready to set this machine up as a domain controller. Now, there's two basic parts to this, and you can't get around doing either of them. First of all, we have to install the ADDS role. Now, ADDS stands for Active Directory Domain Services. So the role has to be installed first. Now, when we install the role, what we're really doing is we're installing these little applications. If that kind of helps you to bring it home a little bit more, we're really just installing stuff that's allowing us to make this machine a domain controller. So after that, we're going to run dcpromo.exe. So it's not enough just to install the role. All right, this is step one. But step two is we have to run this dcpromo.exe wizard. Now, installing the ADDS role, it's very simple. All we have to do is go here in the Server Manager. You see this little section that says Add Roles? We would click on that, and we'll find this little guy when we click on the Roles section here in the tree view. So once we have the Roles section, we click on Add Roles, then we can then install ADDS. Now, DC Promo, let's talk about that for just a second. DC Promo, there's two ways you could run it. You can either run it from the link that's going to be provided after the Active Directory Domain Services role installation, and you can also install it by going to the little search box down from the Start menu and typing DC Promo. It's really 6 of one, half a dozen of another. But I just wanted to let you know that there are two ways to get it done. We're going to be using the Server Manager because I want you to get used to using the Server Manager during this first installation. Now, when we do our second domain controller installation, I'm going to show you a shortcut that's going to save you just a little bit of time. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's move back on over to the server now, and let's get this whole domain controller process started. All right, so what we're going to do first, over here now we are on New York DC1 again. Let's click on the roles section, and let's go over here to the roles link. We're going to click on this, and that's actually going to start a wizard. We're going to be seeing a lot of wizards, and you're going to be humming, the Yellow Brick Road song before too awful long, because we're going to be off to see the wizard a lot all throughout Server 2008. Now, this first page just gives you a little bit of information. It tells you, hey, make sure that your administrator account has a strong password, that your network settings are all set up, and the latest security updates from Windows Update are installed. All right, hey, you know what? We've got all that. We did all of this stuff initially, especially with the administrator account. We've already set that password, the network settings, and the security updates we did in the ICT. I'm going to put a check mark here and skip this page by default because after I've seen it once and read it, I don't need to see it again. So let's go ahead and tell it next. And now we get to decide which roles, which jobs we're going to be installing to our server. So let's go ahead and put a check mark here in Active Directory Domain Services. And we'll tell it next. Now here's some more additional information to Active Directory. There's an overview, how to install it, and common configurations. It's just additional information for you to go back and read as time permits. Right now, we're just going to go ahead and hit next, and it's going to tell you, hey, you know what? The server might need to be restarted after installation completes, and after you install the Active Directory Domain Services role, then we need to use the Domain Services Installation Wizard, also known as, go figure, DC Promo, to make the server a fully functional domain controller. So that's what we're going to do. Let's go ahead and tell it to install. It's going to take a little while to install, so I'm going to pause the video while this guy is pushing that little blue bar across the screen, and as soon as that finishes up, I'll be right back. Alright, so here we are back again, and you see here that our ADDS role has finished up, and so now we're just going to go ahead and run DC Promo by clicking on the link right here. Again, if I really wanted to, I could go here to the Start menu, and I could type DC Promo down here, and I would essentially get the exact same result. It's really, again, 6 of one, half a dozen of another. I'm just go ahead and click here on the link, and that's going to start up this Active Directory Domain Services Installation Wizard. On the front page here, you'll notice that we have Use Advanced Mode Installation. Now, Advanced Mode Installation offers you additional options that are not in the standard wizard. Big surprise, right? I know, a blinding flash of the obvious. Let me real quick, I'm going to click here on this link to Advanced Mode Installation. I just want to tell you about just a few items that are unique to Advanced Mode that you're not going to see in this first wizard. First of all, the Install from Media option. The ability to create domain controllers using a disk that we've created previously from another domain controller. Read-only domain controller. Password replication policy. There's several items in here that we don't need for standard installation, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing, is just a standard domain controller install. So at the end of the day, here's what I want you to remember about Advanced Mode. When you need to do read-only domain controllers, or if you need to do install from media, those are your primary reasons why you would use Advanced Mode. Right now, we don't need Advanced Mode, so I'm going to go ahead and close that, and I'm just going to go ahead and tell it next. Now here's a bunch of stuff about Windows NT security. Now if you have a Windows NT server, and if you need to worry about Windows NT in your network, this has some very important information for you. Basically, you're going to have problems. This is what it's telling you. You're going to have problems if you have a Windows NT server. Now we're not going to have problems with this because remember, all of our servers are going to be Windows Server 2008. But if you do have a Windows NT server and you're anticipating problems, here is the information for that. Now hopefully you won't run into a Windows NT server because that was several years ago when that was the hottest thing, and we have since had advanced iterations of servers, so hopefully that won't be the case for you. But just in case it is, there's again that little link for Microsoft to tell you a little more about it. Okay. So here is a very critical step. We're going to be creating a new domain. Our domain does not exist yet. So we're going to go ahead and click here and create a new domain in a new force. We're starting off with nothing, and we're creating something. All right, so we're going to go ahead and tell it next now. And now we put in the fully qualified domain name of the forest root. Remember, our forest root is simply the very first domain in our network. That's all it is. All right, so we're putting in for ours globalmantics.com. Now let me stop here for just a second and talk to you about this. First of all, if you're going to be putting in here .com, .net, .biz, or any of the standard internet suffixes, you better own that name. If you don't own the name and someone else does, well, there's going to be trouble. All right, let's just leave it at that. There's going to be trouble. So if you would put in here Microsoft.com, they're not going to be happy about that, because when you have connected your domain to a network like, oh, I don't know, the internet, there's going to be DNS requests and all kinds of other things that are labeled with Microsoft.com. So when you're creating your forest root domain name, first of all, make sure it's something that you own if you're going to be using .com, .biz, .net. Have I mentioned that? Yes, I did. Okay. Now, let's say I don't own globalmantics.com yet. Well, I could do globalmantics.local. Okay? There is a security issue there, i.e. enhanced security, because globalmantics.local is not going to initially connect out or allow a lot of connection to the internet out there. Okay? But if I want easier connectivity to the outside world, I can leave it at globalmantics.com. Especially when we're dealing with things like email and web servers and such like that, it's a good idea. But again, you better own the name. If you don't own the name, or you're more security conscious, you can use .local, .msft, you can use .bubba or .sallysu or whatever. It doesn't make any difference. Now, we do happen to own .com, globalmantics.com. We own it. We're good to go for that. So I'm going to go ahead and type that one in and tell it next. All right, we're going to check to see if the forest name is already in use. Always a good thing. Shouldn't take us very long to move on to the next step. All right, here we go. Forest functional level. What's it going to be? Well, we have three options: Windows 2000, Server 2003, and 2008. Here's what a forest functional level is. Each different version of server has different features available to it. Again, BFO, blinding flash of the obvious. If we have Windows 2000 servers acting as domain controllers, then we have to select Windows 2000 functional level. Now, notice down here at the bottom, if you have some domain controllers running later versions of server like 2003, 2008, some of these advanced features are not going to be available, and that's going to make you sad. Now, if you have Server 2003 machines and no Server 2000 machines, you have a lot more features available to you that are going to make your world a lot easier to live in, trust me. If you have only Server 2008 machines like what we're going to have, even better. Now, this is kind of a funny paragraph in here. This forest functional level does not provide any new features over the Server 2003 functional level, but it does say that it will provide unique features. But they're not new. Okay, Microsoft, not sure what you're getting at there, but let me tell you this. There are things that are available at a Server 2008 level that are not available in a Server 2003 level. Now, we're going to talk more about those later on in the course. But for right now, I want you to understand that if we're only going to be installing Server 2008 machines, especially as domain controllers, then we want our forest functional level to be 2008. So the answer to this question is, do you have any 2000 or 2003 domain controllers? If the answer is yes to either one of these, the answer that you have to select here is based upon the oldest operating system that is acting as a domain controller. Okay? So that means if you have 14 Server 2003 domain controllers and one Server 2000 domain controller, then you have to pick Server 2000. If you have 14 Windows Server 2003 and one Server 2008 domain controller, well, then you have to pick Server 2003. If you have only Server 2008 domain controllers, like what we're going to have with globalmantics, then we get the whole kit and caboodle here with the Server 2008 forest functional level. Okay? All right, so I think we've beat that horse to death. Let's go ahead and tell it next. And now it's going to sit here and look at the system here, and now it's bringing up a couple of options here for us. Now you'll see that two of them are grayed out, Global Catalog and Read-Only Domain Controller. Now, Global Catalog, I have a whole video about that, all right? So all I need you to know is that it's required for your very first domain controller. Look here. The first domain controller in force, which is what we have, must be a Global Catalog server and cannot be an RODC. Hence, that's why they're grayed out. Now, in the last video, we talked about how important DNS is to Active Directory. So it's recommended that your very first domain controller also be DNS. Now, we're going to talk more about DNS in this series as well, but I want you to know that this is a really good idea, okay? Even if you don't know anything else about DNS, we're going to talk about it more later. I want you to know that it's a really good idea to have DNS checkmarked in this box at this stage in the game. All right, let's go ahead and tell it next. And now it's going to sit here and spin. And what it's going to tell us here is that a delegation for this DNS server cannot be created because the authoritative parent zone cannot be found, or it does not run DNS. All right, what this is telling us is that it can't find a DNS server out there on our network for globalmantics.com. Well, that's duh, because we haven't created it yet. We're just now creating the actual domain. So, you know, we can go ahead and just tell this, yes, that's fine. We want you to go ahead and create a DNS server for us. Okay, this step, if you don't know what you're doing and you don't have any good reason to change this, leave it alone. Okay, I'm going to talk with you a little bit about what each of these guys are, but you know what? We're going to leave this alone because initially there's not going to be any good reason to change it. Now, first of all, the database folder. Remember, Active Directory is a database. The actual file that holds the data, the actual database file, lives in this folder, Windows/NTDS. And NTDS stands for Network Domain Services, by the way. The log files. Log files are just exactly that. It just keeps track of what's happening. And then sysvol. Let me talk with you about sysvol for a second. Sysvol is a shared folder that is required for domain controllers to talk to each other. Okay, that's what I want you to know about it. It's required for and holds files that allow for domain controllers to talk to one another in a process we call replication, which I'm going to talk with you about in this very video. These are very important files. I'm going to take you to them after we finish this whole process. We want to validate that these folders exist, that a database file is actually in NTDS, and that our sysvol folder is shared. It has a shared item in there. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But keep in mind that this particular guy allows domain controllers to talk to each other. Right? Does a few more things, but that's the core of it. All right, we're going to tell it next. And now we need to create what we call a Directory Services Restore Mode Administrator password. This is not the same password as your domain administrator account. Okay? This password is separate. This is for when things blow up. All right, that's what this guy is for. When your domain controller goes haywire, and you know what? In 10 years of working with this stuff, there's one truth I found, and that is computers do break. I'm going to show you how to use this thing called Restore Mode, Directory Services Restore Mode, later on in this very video series. But for right now, what I need you to know is that you have to create a password for this particular mode, for the eventuality and the inevitability that your domain controller will freak out and do something weird and eventually break. Creating this password, which again is only for restore mode. Okay? It's not your regular administrator password. It's only for restore mode so that we can get in and fix things if it's at all possible. All right, we're going to go ahead and tell it next now. Whoops, looks like I can't seem to type in the same password here on two boxes. Let's go ahead and just try that again. Hey, there we go. All right, so here's the selections. Here's our options that we have selected. Now, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to use this Export Settings button. And what this Export Settings button is going to do is it's going to allow me to take all of the stuff that I've selected, save it to a text file, and I can use it for installation of domain controllers later on down the line. What I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to call this guy answer file in case I want to use it later on. Not a bad thing to have lying around. I'm going to save it, and then we're going to tell that OK. All right, so we have created an answer file for essentially creating a domain controller where we don't have to answer all the questions for the wizard. All right, that's really all there is to it. We'll talk more about it later. I'm going to go ahead and tell this guy next, and now it's going to sit here and write in this little book. I'm going to put a check mark here in reboot on completion. What it's doing is it's setting up Active Directory and really creating the domain for the first time. It's going to take a while, so you know what? We're going to pause the video, and I'll be back as soon as this thing has rebooted, and I'll show you what it's going to look like to log on. Alright, so here you see that our server has rebooted successfully, so let's go ahead and do a Control-Alt-Delete to log on. And hey, there's something new. Globomantic/administrator. I want to switch back on over to the slides. I want to talk with you about what just happened here and why this Globomantic/administrator is here. Alright, so here's what we've created so far. I want to talk with you about this whole password mix. We have created Globomantics.com. Right? Remember, that's our forest root domain because it's the very first domain in our whole network. Here's our machine. We haven't named it New York Site yet because we've just installed Active Directory Domain Services and we're just getting this whole thing started. But here's the deal. The first password that you create is the local administrator. That password is only for this server, for NYDC1-2K8. Now, when we create a domain on this first server, the local administrator password becomes the domain administrator password. And this domain administrator password is good for all of your machines in your domain. This is the head honcho account. And you created it and you didn't even realize it, because we've just taken that local administrator password and moved it up a level. Okay? Now then, it's a really good idea to change the name of the domain administrator account and its password for security. You don't have to, okay? And I want you to understand, you don't have to, but it's just a good idea, all right? So let's move back on over to the server. And as we start to look around at this domain a little bit, this is going to be the first thing that we do. All right, so the password here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to put in our local administrator password because remember, it's the same. All right? All we've done is we've taken the administrator account for the local machine and moved it up to the head honcho level. Press the enter key to go ahead, and I'm logging in now, though, as the domain administrator. I know it's a little bit confusing. Right now, the domain administrator and the local administrator have the same account and password. It's not an optimum situation. So what I'm going to take you through here real quick is just a real easy security thing. We're going to change those up a little bit. Now, the first thing that should show up here on our screen is the server manager. Looks like, there we go. It's taking just a little bit of time, but here we are. Here's our server manager, and we're going to go into the roles section. Let's go ahead and select that guy and expand it. Looks like it's taking just a little bit of time to load up here. That's fairly normal. It's going to collect some data about the roles that we just installed. All right, there we go. All right, we're going to go ahead and expand roles here and go into our Active Directory Domain Services. That's what we're interested in. And we're going to go ahead and expand Active Directory Domain Services. And we're going to go here into Active Directory Users and Computers, because we want to do just a quick tweak on the administrator account. I'm going to expand Active Directory Users and Computers, and here's the Globomantics domain that we just created. And here are the folders that it created for us. I'm going to go into the Users folder, and here is my administrator account that I'm currently logged on with. Now I'm going to right-click on this administrator account, and I'm going to select Rename. And I'm going to name this guy Supercoach. You can rename your administrator account whatever you want. Make it something that's unique. Make it something that's not guessable. Here's the biggest reason why you want to rename the administrator account. If everybody in the world just let their administrator accounts be named administrator, well, you have already half their credentials to hack into a network. All right? Are you seeing where I'm going with this? All right? If I name it Supercoach, then they're not going to know that. All right, so it's going to be easier to break into this particular network. All right, here's a little warning box. The object administrator represents the currently logged on user. Go figure. After renaming this object, it's advisable for the user to immediately log off and log on using the new username to avoid any access conflicts. That's a really good idea, and we're going to do that here. I'm going to go ahead and tell it yes. And our user logon name here, let's go ahead and let's make it Supercoach. Let's go ahead and try to spell it correctly. And we're going to make that at globomantics.com. That's a good idea. All right, so now I'm going to be logging in with Supercoach instead of administrator. All right, let's go ahead and tell that one okay. Now, let's go ahead and let's change the password to. Once again, right-clicking on this guy, and I'm going to select Reset Password. And now I'm going to put in a new password this time around. And making sure that it's the same in both fields. And I'm going to uncheck user must change password at the next logon. All right? I'm changing it right now. Why would I need to change it again after I logged on? So I'm going to go ahead and tell it okay. So now my Supercoach account has a new name and it also has a new password. Fantastic. So every time I log in from here on out, it's going to be with Supercoach. Okay. So we've got the domain administrator account running. Looks like Active Directory users and computers is going. Looks like it did install successfully. I want to take you in real quick though. I want to show you the files and folders that we've created using that DC promo. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize the server manager for just a second. We're going to go to the start menu and to computer. Now, one of the reasons that I want to show you where the stuff is at is that we need to know the locations for later operations that I'm going to teach you, especially during the recovery section. So, this is something that we'll look at right now and you'll use later, but we also want to look at them from a validation standpoint. We want to make sure that this stuff is actually there. Even though Active Directory users and computers seems to be running and operating well inside of Server Manager, let's just double check. It doesn't take very long. So we're going to go into the Windows folder here for this. We're going to scroll down and we're going to find, first of all, Sysvol. Let's take a look at Sysvol here real quick. Remember that I was telling you that Sysvol is a shared folder that allows for replication and communication between domain controllers. Well, this guy is there. He is shared. That's fantastic. Let's just double click and see what's in him. Looks like we got a pointer to globomantics.com. And here's some policies and some scripts. That's as far as I want to take you right now. Let's go ahead and let's go back to the Windows folder. I'm going to click here on the Windows location in the address bar. And now let's go up to NTDS. Remember, Network Directory Services. I'm going to double click on it. And now you'll see here is my ntds.dit. This is the, and I mean the, database for Active Directory. If this guy isn't here, you don't have an Active Directory, okay? You gotta have this guy. Now we have several other files here. Some of them are log files and such, but this is the one you gotta have. Without this, bad things, man. Bad things. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's go back to the Windows folder here. I think it's pretty much all I wanted to show you initially. Let's go ahead and let's close this out and let's go back to Server Manager. Everything is looking good. At this point in time, I think we are ready to go ahead and make a slight change now in our Sites folder. Look down here with me underneath Active Directory Sites and Services. You remember in the last video we were talking about sites and how they were the way that we track stuff physically, right? So we're going to go ahead and expand sites, and here is the default first site name. Now everything lives in a site, even if it's just this first default site. Now I don't like this default first site name. It doesn't make any sense to me. So I'm going to right click on this guy. We're going to rename it right from the start. So that way when we start adding in machines to our New York site, they're all going to be easily found. So we're just going to call it New York site. Or how about just New York? Okay, that's good enough. All right, so we have renamed our default first name site to New York because it's more identifiable. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about sites in additional videos in this series, but we wanted to do this first, okay, because we're setting up our Active Directory initially, and we want everything to be the way we want it to be. If you added in a bunch of computers, a bunch of servers, and a whole bunch of other things into your Active Directory, and you go in and you change the site name, you just might as well buy stock in Aleve or Tylenol, because you're going to have a whole lot of headaches, friends. So just do this right up front. Make them something that is recognizable and usable to you. Okay, so we're good to go for that. And now I really think that we're ready to go ahead and install that second domain controller. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and move back on over to the slides. Let's talk about that second domain controller and what we've built so far. So we now have a functional domain controller. We now have a domain. That's what we have built at this point in time. We have built globomantics.com. That domain was created by New York DC1-2K8. We have renamed our site New York. Remember that? We just did that. So we now have the core of the network. We really have a brain for our globomantics.com network. We're going to now focus in on our second domain controller that's going to be joining our globomantics.com domain. So we're just going to do everything that we just did. Only we're going to do it a little bit faster this time because you now know the process. Again, we have built this guy. We can go ahead and kind of put a check mark in him. And then we're now going to be focusing in on this piece of hardware, New York DC2. Now, of course, New York DC2 isn't named that yet. We have to do an installation of our operating system. Remember, we're going to be doing bare metal installations. This domain controller is going to be joining globomantics.com, not creating it. The hardware is identical. We just need to make some configuration option changes in the ICT, and we're going to be good to go to actually set up our DC. So here we go again. We're going to be installing it bare metal. We're going to configure the basic stuff using the ICT. We're going to install the ADDS role, and we're going to run DC Promo. Now, last time we ran this stuff through Server Manager, but I'm going to show you a shortcut this time. We're not going to be using the Server Manager to do this part. We're only going to be running DC Promo. So we can kind of X this one out. Because here's what's going to happen. When we run DC Promo from the command line, it's going to check to see if the ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services role, is installed. If it's not, it's going to go ahead and install it for us. And then we can move on with a DC Promo wizard just like normal. So let's go ahead and let's move on over to our second server and let's get this installation started. Alright, so I'm booting up DC2 as you see here. Scroll down, the resolution's a little wonky, but you see that Windows is loading files. And so in just a few moments here, we should be greeted with, yep, there we go, the Microsoft little green bar, and now we should come up with the installation wizard. Alright, so there we go. Again, we're just going to walk through this exactly the same as we did last time. Let's go ahead and hit next. We're going to hit install now, and we're just going to do everything that we just did for the first DC, only faster. Alright, so here we are on the selection of your operating systems. We've seen this before. Let's go ahead and pick Enterprise Full Installation and tell it next. And we'll go ahead and we'll accept the license agreement and tell it next again. And once again, we're doing a bare metal clean installation of Windows. Let's go ahead and let's do a quick partitioning here real quick. We'll do a drive options and new. And we're going to go ahead and we'll put in our numbers here. Hit numlock so it'll actually take, and we'll see, it was 81920, wasn't it? That should create for us an 80 gig partition and for the operating system to live on, and then a 40 gig partition for data. Yep, there we go. Alright, I'm going to tell this guy next, and away it goes again. So once again, I'm going to pause the recording, and then I'll be right back as soon as we're ready for the next step. Okay, no surprises here. We have rebooted the machine, and now we need to go ahead and create that local administrator password, right? So clicking here in the box, and we'll do a quick password entry. And I could again create a password reset disk. I'm going to cheat this time and not do that. However, do as I say, not as I do, right? So go ahead and when you're setting up yours, make sure you create your password reset disks. Go ahead and log in here, and don't worry if you don't do it right then. You can always make them later, okay? So don't sweat it. Tell it okay. And now it's going to go ahead and load us up into the desktop and into the ICT, where we can do all of our basic configurations. And we're only really making a couple of changes from what we did last time, primarily the computer name and the IP address, because this box is going to be a duplicate of the first DC. Remember, for fault tolerance, so in case one of them dies, we have another as a backup, and for better performance, so that one machine isn't doing all the work. And there's our ICT up just like you should be. So we're going to go ahead and just go down this punch list real quick. Let's go ahead and set our time zone from from Pacific to Eastern. Go ahead and we'll set that guy there real quick. All right. And we'll tell that okay. I'm not going to worry about the internet time. I'm going to go ahead and let the time.windows.net server go ahead and take care of that. Let's go ahead, let's configure our networking real quick. And again, we're living in an IP version 4 world, and GlobalManTix is not going to be an IP version 6 network, at least not at this time. So we're going to go ahead and remove the IP version 6 stuff so it doesn't interfere with anything, and then go ahead and configure it for IP version 4. I'm going to go ahead and double click on this particular item, and let's go ahead and set our IP address real quickly. And remember, this was going to be 192.168.5.3. So our first one is 0.2, right? The subnet mask is configured for us, and our default gateway is going to be 192.168.5.1. Now our DNS server, let's talk about the DNS server thing real quick. The DNS server for the second domain controller, we want it to be on the first machine. So we're going to tell it to look to 192.168.5.2. We're going to be using the first domain controller as our primary DNS machine. And speaking of the DNS over on that first machine, while we're talking about it, let's go ahead and bounce on over to NYDC1. I want to show you something that's really interesting about this whole DNS server box. All right, over here on DC1, looks like I need to log back in here real quick. And you know what? We need to go ahead and cancel out of this and switch the user, because we need to log on as Supercoach, don't we? So we're going to go ahead and do a Control-Delete and Other User. And we're going to log on here with our new Supercoach account and our new Supercoach password. All right, we'll go ahead and we'll close out of the server manager. Actually, we'll just minimize it for the time being. And we're going to go take a look at our network connection real fast. Down here in the task pane in the notification bar, I'm going to right click on it and go to the Network and Sharing Center. And now I'm going to go to Manage Network Connections. I'm going to double click here on Local Area Connection, and let's take a look in the properties for this particular item. I'm going to go ahead and double click on TCP/IP version 4, and hey, look at this. The preferred DNS server for this particular machine is 127.0.0.1. Now the default gateway is the same, the subnet mask is the same, the IP address is the same, but this has changed. The reason why this has changed is that when we installed the DNS server, it was the only DNS server in the network. And so it said, okay, you know what? I'm going to use myself as the DNS server. And that's going to be okay. All right, we're going to go ahead and leave this guy as he is for right now. We're going to come back to him, though, and make a quick change as soon as we finish setting up DC2 as the domain controller and a DNS server. All right, so back over here on DC2, which is where we're at, we're going to go ahead and we're going to leave this A-OK. We're going to tell this guy OK, OK, and close. All right, we're going to close out our network box here. And we're going to run through the rest of our punch list. Let's go ahead and let's change the computer name. Now, some of you think, hey, you know what? We have a domain name. Can we go ahead and join this computer to the domain? Well, it's just going to waste time. All right. So all we're going to do right now is we're going to change the computer name from this crazy mess, and we're going to change it to NYDC2-2K8. There we go. We're just going to leave it as a member of the work group. And let me tell you why. DC Promo is going to take care of joining it to globalmantics.com. We don't have to mess with it if we don't want to. You can if you want to. It's not going to hurt anything, but it's not going to help anything either. So we're going to go ahead and leave it as it is. Tell it OK. Now remember, we always have to restart the machine when you rename the computer. So we're going to tell it OK, and we're going to close, and we're going to restart now. Nothing has been different so far, has it? I mean, we've done the installation exactly the same. We've ran the ICT almost the same way. We've substituted in a different name. We've substituted in a different IP address. So I'm going to go ahead and let this guy reboot. I'm going to pause the video, and then as soon as it's done, I'll be right back. All right, DC2 has now rebooted. Let's go ahead and let's log into him. Now remember, we're logging in with the local administrator password for this machine that we created as soon as it installed. We are not logging in as SuperCoach, all right? So I'm going to go ahead and hit the Enter key and go ahead and bring this guy up. All right, so there we go. We should be greeted with the ICT here really quickly. Yep. All right, so we must have done good. Let's go ahead and let's set our automatic updating and feedback options real quick. And we'll manually configure the settings for the automatic updates. We'll check for updates, but let me choose whether to download or install them. We'll go ahead and we'll include recommended updates too. Probably won't hurt anything. Windows error reporting. Let's go ahead and change the setting. And we're going to have it ask me about setting reports, right? Just in case we have sensitive data up. We'll tell that OK. And right now, the current setting for the Customer Experience Improvement Program is that we're not participating. And again, we're very concerned about security, so we're going to leave that as it is. We'll click on Close. Let's go ahead and let's download and install the updates here real quick. And just to have that one done, again, looks like we have the exact same updates as before. So we have 25.8 megabytes worth. And again, nothing is really different. I mean, we're just doing the exact same thing that we did last time. The differences are going to come in whenever we run DC Promo. We're going to see some different options in there. Now again, while this guy is downloading updates and installing them, I'm going to pause the video because, well, you've seen it before. There's no big surprises. And so I'm going to go ahead and let this guy roll through. We're going to restart the machine, and then I'm going to log back in and then start recording again. Okay, so DC2 has rebooted. Let's go ahead and log back on. Again, we're logging on with the local administrator password. We're not logging in yet with the domain administrator password SuperCoach because this machine is not yet joined to the domain. It doesn't even know that GlobalMantics exists yet, so we only can use the local administrator password. All right, so it should take just a second here for it to load back up here for us. And once again, here's our ICT list, giving us information about all the stuff that we have done so far. Let's go ahead and let's enable the remote desktop real quick again. We're going to go ahead and allow connections only from computers running remote desktop with remote level authentication. And you see, once again, that it's going to provide us with exceptions in the firewall automatically. We don't have to go into firewall and configure that. It just makes our life just a little bit easier. Tell that OK and this OK. Firewall has been configured. Now we can go ahead and make alterations here, but we don't need to at this point in time. And so our last step is to make sure that this guy does not show back up whenever we're booting up again. All right, so let's close the ICT, and we're going to wait just a moment here for our server manager. Our next step is to actually install Active Directory domain services. we could go to roles and install Active Directory domain services that way. But I told you I'm going to show you a shortcut, and that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to go ahead and minimize the server manager and go straight to the start menu. I'm going to type DC Promo here in the search box. You can see right up here at the top it finds DC Promo for me automatically. I can actually just hit the enter key right now to run that command. Alright, now we're talking. And look, it's telling you that the Active Directory domain services binaries are being installed. Because we didn't install ADDS role initially, it's going to go ahead and install it for us right now. Basically, all we're doing is we're skipping one step. Is it right or wrong to do it this way? No, it's really neither. It doesn't make a difference whether you do it from the server manager or if you just go in and type DC Promo. For a lot of more experienced and more veteran folks, they like to do this. You know, I'd say it's up to you. If you don't mind the server manager interface, you know, it's fine. If you're in a hurry and you just want to skip all that, just go to that search box. Now, it is going to take a little while for this to go and to install, so I'm going to pause the video right now. And yes, I know. Like, man, Coach, how many times are we going to pause? Well, as much fun as it is to watch this little blue box bounce across the screen, you know, it's really not that interesting. So I'll be right back. All right, so it wasn't very long that I had to pause the recording, actually. It was only just another couple of minutes. But you see here now we have the new Active Directory Domain Services installation wizard again. It's the exact same wizard as you saw last time, but this time we're going to go into Next. Again, here's a bit about the whole Windows NT thing. Yeah, we've seen that before. We'll hit Next. This time we need to make a choice, or a change in our choice, I should say. We're going to add a domain controller to an existing forest. Okay? We're going to be adding a domain controller to an existing domain. I'm going to show you this whole create a new domain in existing forest in a different video. But we're going to be adding this DC2 machine to globomantics.com that was created by our first server. So we're going to go ahead and tell it next. And now we need to put in the name of our server, or I'm sorry, the name of our domain, globomantics.com. But we need to supply alternate credentials because right now we're logged on as the local administrator. Remember, the local administrator is only just for this machine. But what we want to do is we want to connect this machine over to Globomantics. So we have to use our SuperCoach login, our SuperCoach credential that we created earlier, or renamed, I guess you would say, and the SuperCoach password, which is different than our local administrator account, and tell it OK. Because the SuperCoach administrator account has permissions to take this machine and make it part of Globomantics. Okay? That's why we had to supply those credentials, that log on instead. I'm going to tell it next. It's going to sit here and take a look around. It did find globomantics.com. That's really good news for us. That means that this machine is connecting to and talking to our first domain controller, NYDC1. So we'll tell it next. It'll sit here and spin. We are going to be assigning this machine to the New York site. That's why I wanted to make sure that we renamed it earlier. Remember when we renamed that default first name thing to New York? This is why. Now I'm going to tell this next. Now here's the next question. Do we want this domain controller to also be a DNS server and a global catalog? Now in our instance, in Globomantics, as we're setting up these two machines to be fault tolerant, remember if one dies we still have the other one, the answer is going to be yes. We want both DNS server and global catalog to be part of this server. Now the read-only domain controller thing, look how it is now available to us. The reason why read-only domain controller, RODC, is available is we now have a full domain controller available to copy stuff from. But that's a whole different video that we'll tackle later on in this very series. For right now, we're going to go ahead and leave DNS server checked and global catalog checked, so we have as identical of a machine as we can to DC1. Let's tell it next. And now it's going to give us this little warning message about how it can't find the authoritative parent zone, blah, blah, blah. Here's what I want you to understand about this box. DC Promo is going to take care of DNS for us, so all we have to do is tell it yes. Okay, so don't let this box freak you out. There's nothing to worry about. All we have to do is tell it yes, and we'll work with DNS again in a different video. Once again, we have our locations for our Active Directory files. That looks good. We're going to tell it next. And once again, we have to create the Directory Services Mode Administrator password. So, generally speaking, here's my recommendation to you as I'm typing this in. Use the same Directory Restore Mode password on every machine. Okay? That way you only have one password to write down. Now, some security guys might argue with me about that, say, well, you know, some servers need to be more secure than others, and you want to use a different one. That's up to you and your company's security analysts and consultants and your company's security policy. I'm going to recommend to you to just use the same one on every single machine. You should probably write down this Directory Services Restore password, though, in a logbook that's kept in a safe location. That way, even if you forget, let's say that you're not at work that day, or let's say that you go on to bigger and better things sometime in the future, and the server blows up, somebody can go back to the logbook, look up that password, and be able to go into Directory Services Restore mode. Okay, so you're not only just helping yourself, but you're also helping the future. Okay, just think about that. All right, enough of that. Next, and we're going to go ahead and export the settings real quick to create an answer file. So we're going to call this answer file DC2 real quick. And we'll tell it OK. Looks like that was successful. Fantastic. And we'll tell it next. And now away it goes. Now while this is going, notice that the picture has kind of changed. Last time we saw one domain controller, one server, and one book. Notice this time around we have this guy over here. What's happening is that DC2 is talking to DC1. They're communicating, and what we're doing is we're actually creating a copy of the Active Directory services, or actually Active Directory database that's living over on DC1. Remember, we want to have two almost identical machines. So we need to have duplicate copies of the Active Directory database on both locations. Server 2008 knows that, it intrinsically understands that, and it's doing it. We don't have to tell it, hey, make sure you get a copy of the database from the other server, because it just knows it. So you don't have to worry about that. All right, so while this guy is copying the database, copying Active Directory and its settings from DC1 over here, we're going to go ahead and go drink a cup of coffee. All right, so I'm going to put a check mark in reboot on completion, and then as soon as this guy is done and it reboots, I'll be back and we're going to log in with our domain administrator account, Supercoach. All right, so here we are again. We have rebooted the machine. Hey, there's a big surprise, right? We're going to do a Control-Alt-Delete. Now remember how we were saying about how the administrative account has been renamed and has a new password? Yeah. This is Globomantic/administrator, and this account doesn't exist anymore. Now, the local computer administrator account still exists, but that's not where we're trying to log in as. We're trying to log in as the domain administrator. So what we have to do is we have to switch user. And so we're going to select other user here, and we're going to put in Supercoach. As soon as I can learn how to spell here, there we go. And the new Supercoach password, and away we go. All right, there we go. There's our server manager back. So let's go over, let's check out the role section here. While this guy is loading up, it might take just a little bit longer for it to figure out exactly what it has on it. There we go, Active Directory Domain Services, select that. And here's the Active Directory users and computers. That's what we're interested in. Let's go ahead and expand that. Here's the globomantics.com domain. Expand that. Let's go into users. And there's the Supercoach account that we're currently logged in with right now. And that's really the only alteration that we've made between the two machines. So that's good news. We've actually copied the Active Directory from DC1 over here to DC2. That's good news. One more quick check. Let's go to the Start menu and to the computer. And let's just do a quick check to see if on the C drive and in the Windows directory here, do we have sysvol? There it is. Yes. Is it shared? Yes. All right. Fantastic. We do have policies and scripts. Neat-o. Just backing up here, let's go to NTDS. Do we have ntds.dit? Yes, we do. Hey, we're looking good, friends. So we're going to go ahead and call this one set up. But let's take a look now at that whole DNS situation I was showing you earlier. I'm going to go back here to the Server Manager section so that I can quickly and easily get back over to the network connections. Like I told you earlier, Server Manager is really kind of a one-stop shop in terms of having all the stuff that you're going to do on a regular basis. It's going to be right here. All right, I'm going to go here to View Network Connections. And I'm going to double-click here on the local area connections here. That is globalmatics.com. And go into the properties. Let's take a look at the IP version 6 settings, and let's see what's happening now with the preferred DNS server and the alternate DNS server. Well, would you look at that? The preferred DNS server, it hasn't changed, has it? But the alternate DNS server has now a new entry. Now, we didn't put anything in there, right? But it is now pointing to itself. So let's say for some weird reason, DC1 decides to go down and decides to kind of flop all over like a fish. It's not a big deal because this particular domain controller can still reference itself as a domain controller. This is a good example of redundancy and fault tolerance. But you know what? Let's move back on over to DC1 now, because here's what I want to do. Okay? Right now, DC2 is looking at DC1 as its primary DNS server. Remember, it's just like a phone book, right? DC2 is going to look at itself as a secondary just in case DC1 goes down. But let's say that DC2 goes down. Or let's say that we just want to have an alternative to this particular machine. Let's go ahead and move on over to DC1. And what we're going to do is we're going to switch over, or I really should say add to the DNS settings. We're going to make sure that DC1 can also look at DC2, so we have that redundancy and fault tolerance happening in there. All right, so back here on DC1, as you see up top here, we're going to go ahead and put in the alternate DNS server information here for 192.168.5.3. That is the IP address for DC2. A little fault tolerance and redundancy can go a long way in the network. So really what we have is we have two domain controllers that still can use each other as DNS services. That's a good idea. You know, it's not a bad thing to have that fault tolerance. Just in case one goes down, you always have the backup, right? Okay, let's go ahead and let's tell this guy okay, and close, and let's close this one. So we're pretty much done with DC1 right now. Let's bounce on over to DC2, and let's double check that guy. Over here in DC2, we're going to go ahead and close out these windows too, and go back to the Server Manager. So DC1 and DC2 are up. They're moving. Active Directory is installed. They are both domain controllers. They have DNS settings. They are referencing each other as DNS servers. Everything is looking good, but let's go back over to the slides now, because there's one more thing that we need to test before we call this a complete success. All right, so let's talk now about this really big word, replication. Here's the deal. Our two domain controllers, they need to be friends, all right? They need to be able to talk to each other, and they need to be able to keep duplicate records in their respective Active Directory databases. This makes sure that basically both domain controllers can know what's going on. They can both be what we might call authoritative even. So when something changes in the domain, those changes, depending upon which domain controller catches that change, they need to be recorded and communicated with each other. So for example here, you see down at the bottom I've got a couple of domain controllers hanging out here. The ones that we just built, as a matter of fact. So the first domain controller says, hey, the admin just added 3 OUs, 4 user accounts, and renamed one of the old user accounts. Well, DC2 says, hey, okay, got it. I'll record those things in the Active Directory database in my copy. But you know what? I got some stuff that's changed too. And so DC1's going to say, hey, you know what? I got your changes. I'm going to go ahead and record them in my copy of the database so I know what's going on as well. So they need to be able to talk. And if they can't talk, we're going to have massive problems in the database as time goes on. So let's talk about how can we make these things talk. Now, this whole process of talking and recording changes is called, of course, replication. The easiest way to check replication in between two domain controllers is what we're going to do is we're going to create what we call a new organizational unit. Now, you've heard me mention these before in the last video. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create one. It's just going to be a real easy right click. It's nothing to worry about. And we're going to make that in our globalmantics.com domain over there in Active Directory users and computers. You know what? We can create this test dummy OU on either DC. It doesn't make any difference. Then we need to go to the command line and we're going to type a very simple command. repadmin/sync all. And repadmin, just so you know, stands for replication administration. And sync all is, it means sync all. It's take all your domain controllers and synchronize their databases. Then, once you've done that on one domain controller, then you bounce on over to the other domain controller. You take a look here in Active Directory users and computers to see if that OU has shown up over there. If it does, well, that really means that your two domain controllers are talking, and they're now BFFs. And if you're not familiar with TeamSpeak, the BFF stands for Best Friends Forever. All right, so just so you know, you might need to hit F5 to refresh the screen to see the new items show up in Server Manager. Sometimes Server Manager is just a little bit behind what's really happening with the Active Directory database. So hitting F5 will refresh the screen to make sure you have all the most updated info about that particular section of your network. All right, so let's go ahead and let's try this out. Let's see if we can get our replication working between our two domain controllers. And we can do this on either one. So tell you what, let's go over to DC2 and let's try this process there. And then we'll go over and we'll check on DC1 to see if our organizational unit shows up. All right, here we are over on DC2, and I'm going to go here into the globalmantics section of the domain. Now I'm right here underneath Active Directory users and computers. I'm going to create a new folder, oftentimes called an organizational unit, but if you want to call it a folder for now, that's just fine. I'm going to right click over here in the folder section and select new, and then select organizational unit. And I'm just going to name this guy Test Dummy real quick. You can name it whatever you want. Doesn't make any difference, really. And tell that OK. And now Test Dummy is now an added folder here underneath globalmantics.com. What we're going to do now is we're going to ensure that DC2 talks to DC1 and exchanges the information on this particular object. DC1 should record information about Test Dummy. Let's go ahead and let's go to the Start menu. And I'm going to type CMD just because that's what I'm used to. And that's going to open up what we call a command line interface. Now, this is nothing new. As a matter of fact, I'm sure you've probably seen this about 1 billion times before. And if you haven't, you're going to get to know this guy really well, because in the command line, there's a lot of great things that we can make happen that we just can't make happen otherwise. All right, so we're going to type repadmin /sync all. And we'll hit the enter key. And we'll see if we get any errors. Doesn't look like it. Terminated with no errors. That means our two domain controllers did, in fact, talk. So now what we need to do is we need to go over to DC1 and let's see if Test Dummy shows up over there. As you see, I'm over here on DC1 now, and let's go into the roles section, into Active Directory Domain Services, into Active Directory Users and Computers, and here into the globalmantics.com domain. And would you look at that? There's test dummy. Well, that's fantastic news, isn't it? Because here's what just happened. DC2 talked to DC1, and DC1 realized that DC2 had something he didn't. And so DC1 made a copy of test dummy, and now we have duplicate databases on both domain controllers. So we have a redundancy now. If one dies, the other one's still going, and we can still do business. Okay, so you know what? Your two domain controllers are set up. They're talking to each other. They're exchanging information. These guys are pretty much set to go. So let's go ahead and let's move back on over to the slides. I want to talk with you a little bit about what we've covered, and we'll wrap this one up, huh? All right, so this is what we've built. We've built the brain of our network, and we have built the globalmantics.com domain. We have established two domain controllers that are identical, NYDC1 2K8, NYDC2 2K8. We have renamed our site that these two machines are going to live in, New York site. They are talking to each other. They are able to communicate changes back and forth, so they share duplicate copies of the database. And not only that, they also can utilize each other's DNS servers for stuff that they need to find over the network. So you know what? We've got a great start here. So I want to talk with you now about some of the terms that you should know after viewing this course. Just as a quick review, bare metal installation. You should know that this is installing an OS just on a clean hard drive. An upgrade installation, you should know that it's installing Server 2K8 on a machine that's already running Server 2003. The ICT, Initial Configuration Task List. Just a convenient way to set up basic stuff on Server 2008. DC Promo, you've seen it twice. This is just the wizard that sets up the Active Directory. It promotes a machine up to domain controller status. The ntds.dit, that's your database file for Active Directory, right? Sysvol. This is, by the way, is a little more formal definition than what I gave you earlier, but it's just a shared folder that stores the server copy of the domain's public files that must be shared for common access and replication throughout a domain. And what that really means is it's there so that domain controllers can talk, all right, so they can replicate, if you will. Replication, as you know this already, this is the process of exchanging and recording changes in Active Directory between domain controllers. All right, so there's some terms. Let's talk about some stuff you should be able to do now after watching this video. You should be able to evaluate hardware, and you should be able to determine whether or not this thing's really going to be able to support Server 2008. Describe some basic differences between versions of Server 2008 and describe what a bare metal installation is. I've taken you through two bare metal installations, so by now you should be able to do that. I know that was a piece of cake, wasn't it? You should be able to use that initial configuration task list. And we did several things. Configure the time and date, rename the machine, configure some static IP addresses and DNS for networking, configure those automatic updates, the feedback stuff. You should be able to install the Active Directory Domain Services role. And you know, in this video, we've done that two different ways. We got the same result, right? The first time we used the role wizard, and the second time we just used DC Promo. And you should be able to run that DC Promo wizard too to promote a server to domain controller status. And we did that two ways. One, to create the domain, and remember we call that the forest root, right? And also to a second domain controller. We ran it there as well. You should be able to verify if two domain controllers are replicating. Remember, all you got to do is just go in, pop in a new Active Directory object, like a new folder like we did with the organizational unit, and run repadmin sync all, right? So it's a real easy process. You know, what did it take us? Like 2 minutes? And I think just as long as it took me to talk you through it. So hey, you know what? We've wrapped up. We've got a lot of good work done. So now that our first two DCs are up, in the next video, we're going to start adding those user accounts for Globalmantics. And we're going to organize them according to departments and all kinds of new stuff. So thanks for hanging with me for this video. And you know what? I'll see you in the next one.